begin. This is a horror short story. As such, content warning. It contains scenes of graphic violence, things that you would find in a horror thing, but I just feel like I have to state that. This story is based on a completely ridiculous idea I had one night for an end of the world scenario. And I realized I'd created a world that my dad, who passed away from throat and mouth cancer, would be kind of a superhero. So this is dedicated to my dad. It's called The Death of Vic Whitaker. Victor Whitaker, Vic, don't ever call him Victor, was sprawled out on his yellow, mildew-ridden, and supremely comfortable couch when he first saw the report that a large Italian sub had bitten off the tongue of a college-age kid. Vic had only about 3 seconds of thinking that Jack Williams, the 6 o'clock lead anchor for Channel 4 News, would be a public prank. Someone was pranking him, or he'd suffered some kind of brain injury or break from reality. Those 4 seconds occurred because Jack himself was unable to believe and thus continued watching the story. The next thing he said was, several eyewitnesses present at the revered D'Angelo's confirmed that the sandwich had in fact attacked Chris Sorensen, a student at Bunker Hill Community College. Vic sat up on his couch and leaned in closer to his television. Fuck. That was the start of the insanity. Within 6 hours, most of humanity was dead. The mechanism was simple, yet impossible to fully grasp by a single person. Any individual that had undigested food anywhere in their body were devoured from the inside by whatever it was that was still close to the form it had on the way in. That first wave took care of 99.99, doesn't matter percent of the people. The human race didn't just drop dead, it writhed in unimaginable agony as it went. Vic was one of the survivors. Had contracted throat and mouth cancer 4 years before history's most fucked up food fight, had most of his tongue and his entire jaw removed as a result, and fed himself through a feeding tube that was threaded through a hole in his stomach. Vic's only sources of sustenance were water and a not-food chalky substance called nutrients. Nutrients didn't animate because all it consisted of was a solution of the molecules that the digestive system breaks food down into in the first place. Vic celebrated by starting up his smoking habit again on fuego, sucking back 3 packs in 12 hours. He then became incredibly sick and choke vomited a tablespoon of nutrients. That was another bonus from his surgery. There was a decent possibility of death whenever upchuck occurred. As a footnote, Jack Williams died in his office at the Channel 4 studios. He had a strawberry Danish that was still Danishy in his polished, professional, and reserved, yet still charismatic stomach. The strawberry jam transformed into a kind of aberrant jellyfish, spouting sweet, delicious, and highly venomous tendrils. The chunks of pastry liked how sea urchins rolled, I guess. So each glob underwent an accelerated stale. As they did, spikes of dough shot out like confectionery fireworks before the things achieved rock-like hardness. Vic had questions. He went out into the world to answer at least a couple of those questions. He was outside for all of 5 minutes before he had to go back inside and retrieve his cane. And his cane needed modifications. He hadn't taken into consideration that it was nearly Halloween, and now there was a standing army of pissed-off pumpkins roaming the streets. And because each had undergone their own unique version of the movie Hostel, with whatever family they were at, mostly at the hands of smiling and cheerful parents and their children, they were all slightly upset about the whole thing. The bastards got legs, they got damn legs. Vic kept repeating as he drove nails through the curved handle part of his walking stick. Sufficiently armed, Vic ventured once more onto the breach, and by the time he returned to his tiny assisted living apartment, his cane was covered with the entrails of 7 pumpkin oblongs. Vic felt like a victorious Roman gladiator, rinsing gourd guts off in a sink. But the fact that pumpkin oblongs existed half answered one of his questions. What's the story with fruits and vegetables? The answer? As soon as they dropped off a tree, pulled from their roots, or picked off their plant, they became bizarro world little monsters. Most were comical and therefore harmless, strawberries being the most hilarious. Strawberries changed in only one regard. They could speak, words, sentences. Planet Earth had birthed its second species capable of sophisticated language. There was a catch, however. All they did was fucking complain and insult humans and higher animals too. Strawberries assumed that everything that was alive could understand them, and so if Rover the dog happened to pass by one of those square green baskets with 10 to 20 of the things in them, Rover would notice that there was a cacophony of things that sounded like their master, look at them for 3 seconds, and then continue on his way. Conversely, Strawberries would have flung choice zingers as, "Your breath smells like shit, Rover. Does that mean you have shit for brains too?" 15 Strawberries laughed like idiots. "Hey, Rover, your mom called last night. I called her a bitch and she said thank you." 15 Strawberries laughed like idiots. Other minutia. Any food product in a can, in a package, or wrapped somehow died in the womb, so to speak. Every last can of soup, package of Twinkies, or box of cereal became wholly unedible after their death. Each became their own self-contained sewer of absolute filth. Nick wondered how many people were left after the day the Earth food killed. That question came back with a ballpark answer about a year later, after the survivors had more or less adapted sufficiently to not die at the hands of psychotic popcorn, not the stuff in bags, it was the stuff left over in movie theater, carnivals, and fairs that ended up sprouting wigs and becoming bigger assholes than wasps, or donut opposites. The answer was about 300,000 total, worldwide. The last piece of minutia, an innocent enough question to ponder was, would other animals undergo a similar kind of reckoning? Were the cute little koalas infested with the eucalyptus leaves that morphed into chlorophyll-producing tapeworms? Did squirrels' heads explode from the nuts they hoarded, which stayed in an inanimate state until they were eaten by their hosts, changing into brain tumor legumes? Yep. The world didn't have long before it literally ate itself. The species disappeared by the handfuls at a time, starting with the herbivores, oddly enough. Carnivores that ate their prey whole did the best. Viruses and bacteria were fine, mostly. Vic heard on his radio at one point that whales had the best chance of continued survival because their diets consisted of plankton. Plankton just fed on smaller, microscopic other plankton. So the world wasn't going to go to complete shit. There were a couple of food chains that would be relatively okay. So, Vic spent his time reading, making models of ships, sleeping, and doing puzzle books. Nothing had really changed for him, really. His cancer, surgery, and modified existence going forward from that made him uniquely suited for a world without food. That ship had sailed for him long before, so no big deal. Vic woke up one morning, decided to fill the day with a novel. Novels weren't really his first choice for reading material. He preferred nonfiction, essays, and poetry, but only Irish poetry. If it wasn't Yeats or, well, it was just Yeats. It was garbage. There was a bookcase he kept near his bed that held his novel section. When he began to scan, his eyes seemed to seek The Hobbit of their own accord. It had been his favorite novel since he'd read it in his early 20s. But there was another level of significance to Tolkien's tale of an unlikely hero. It was the first story he read to his son Joe. The readings, when they occurred, were not limited to 10-minute segments at bedtime. In fact, bedtime sessions were the exception rather than the rule. The Hobbit was adventure non de plume. The title itself is a euphemism for an underdog right off the bat. Once one understood what a Hobbit was in the first place, Bilbo Baggins, despite being a strange race in a made-up fantasy world, made a perfect audience surrogate. He didn't know what dwarves were, really didn't care either. And whenever Gandalf shows up, there's a genuine friendship, but one gets the feeling that Gandalf frightens the shit out of him. Bilbo is asked to go on this adventure, and so, basically, are you. And you and Bilbo are off. That's what Vic loved most about The Hobbit. He was never happier than when he was reading it to Joe. Joe thought it was okay. He never mentioned that he was nearly as wild in The Hobbit as he seemed to be. What Joe loved more was seeing how happy his father was. He felt in his own way that by listening to his father share The Hobbit with him, he made his father happy. A state he rarely saw him in. It's just how it was. Vic pulled the book out from its place between a Western novel and another Cormac McCarthy Soul Destroyer and regarded its cover. It was poorly drawn, barely discernible rendering of the Shire, and Vic loved it anyway. For him, that was what the Shire looked like and no other way. The dimensions of the book were much different than your standard hardcover or paperback. At 14 by 9, it was a challenge just to hold the thing. The best approach was to tuck it under one arm and apply pressure to it with your armpit, and even that was woefully inadequate. Vic was incapable of performing that feat of dexterity and strength in his physical state, so he walked to his living room with the book held as if it was a serving tray. He sat down in his recliner chair, green and new, that had no business being part of the same living room as the couch that simply wouldn't die. Vic opened up to chapter 1, An Unexpected Party, and began to read. When he read the last sentence of the content, he began to weep. Vic didn't stop for an hour. As a counterpart to his throat and mouth cancer, Vic's relationship with his son had sustained damage. Their last words to each other were as follows. Here, this is your only friend now. These were Vic's. Joe had been blind drunk for 4 days straight after a breakup with a girl. Vic felt as though tough love was needed at that moment. So Vic threw a half-drank bottle of Jim Beam at him, hitting his son square in the face. Joe was so drunk he barely noticed. Joe fumbled for its landing spot, took it, and slammed back a hefty, horrifyingly large belt. They were both terrible alcoholics. You ruined me, asshole. You made me into this, like father, like son, right? That's what Joe said. And they hadn't spoken since. Joe had sat down for a pizza with a date on that night, that fateful night. Vic knew this because on the third day, it was the very last question that remained to be answered. His gladiatorial weapon was useless against the monstrosity the pizza had become, and in the apartment the thing had nearly kicked Vic as well. But oddly enough, he lucked into discovering its weakness. Vinegar. Makes sense, thought Vic, trying to pull his thoughts away from what it had done to his son and his date. The acid broke apart the grease and cheese nervous system, also visible, like a nauseating exoskeleton fat, and the thing clawed itself to death. It was a meat lover's. That's why it had claws. Vic also thought a pizza monster, such as it was, should be hilarious. It was the least funny thing in existence. 6 years later, 5 since Vic had read that first chapter of The Hobbit, never picked it up again. New trends in gallon jugs of water kept his body going, enough to keep the lights on, so to speak. He kept breathing, seeing, experiencing the world such as it was. There were a total of 78 survivors in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And after 5 years, they had all grown begrudgingly close to one another. At one point, a delegation of 20 of them went to Washington as part of an ersatz reestablishment of the good old USA. Of course, being from Massachusetts, they were instantly disliked, as the trademark arrogance and illusory sense of superiority had also survived the culinary cataclysm. While there, they were brothers and sisters in arms. They began arguing amongst themselves the second they departed. They were the strawberries at that convention in a kind of way. Vic was not in any kind of physical condition to make the trip. The diet of nutrients and water kept him alive, but what it was really was a protracted physical withering. More accurate, it was like drinking from the wrong grail, slowed down to 1/100,000th speed. One morning, Vic woke up on his couch drenched in sweat. His apartment was no more than 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Something was seriously wrong, and it had nothing to do with cancer. He started to get up from his couch, and the moment his head rose a foot from the cushion where he lay in the living room, turned into an amusement park ride. The kind that comes with those half-ass warnings for pregnant women, people with heart conditions, and children printed at the bottom of his placard. Vic could do nothing else but lay down and attempt to wait out whatever this was out. Vic never left the couch that day. There was a can of Nutrends within arm's reach, fortunately, so there wasn't any other complications to deal with during the 12 hours he lay there. 12 hours staring up into the dilapidated, cracking ceiling. But it was a sufficient amount of time for Vic to not just lose the will to live like it took car keys or wallet, but vaporize it entirely like it had never existed at all. And when it was gone, like it had been hit with a 5,000-watt laser, Vic laughed hysterically, the kind that goes past making one side hurt straight into aneurysm. brain hemorrhage territory. Vic, a lifelong conversationalist with himself, discussed the matter.
Vic, old man, what's so damn funny? Well, I'll tell you, sir, if you buy me another round.
Vic hadn't drank in almost 15 years. Another fringe benefit of the cancer was being physically unable to ingest any alcohol. Joe had resented him for that, and had told him so before they broke off contact. Fathers and sons are like that sometimes, resenting a person for not getting out of dipsomania free card because they had to have half their face removed. Vic really wanted to get as blind drunk as possible at the moment, not so much as craving an all points Bolton prime directive, nothing else matters compulsion that overrid anything else when it struck. Alcoholism's like that sometimes. No round then?
Well, I'll tell you anyway, my good man. I have no jaw, a fraction of my tongue, and I can barely speak. I have to clean what's left in my mouth with baking soda and mouthwash 3 times a day. I have a permanent hole in my stomach that also needs to be cleaned the same way, and I portion out my food in millimeters. I've lived like this for 17 years. That doesn't sound funny at all, sir. But Vic, I haven't reached a punchline yet. Patience. Do go on. 6 years ago, the laws of nature up and decided that they weren't laws, really, more guidelines. A goddamn pizza decapitated my son, and for good measure, melted off half of his face. He looked like a wax museum exhibit accident. But no, sir, it didn't stop there. The pizza had nothing to do for 3 days, at least until I showed up and grabbed a bottle of vinegar that had been out on Joe's counter for a reason God knows why. I smashed it on that thing, and what I saw resembled something being electrocuted with an industrial generator. Sir, if you're pulling my leg, I'll have you know I am in no mood for it. Vic, I only speak the truth to you. I have serious doubts on whether or not any sort of merriment can be had from this tale. Are you feeling well, Victor? The perfect segue into the punchline, Vic. You see, after all of these things, as tragic and ludicrous and mad and devastating as they are, I have survived it all. But now I know what it is that will kill me, sir, and to me it is hilarious for it to be so. Well, what is it then, old man? I'm going to die of a broken heart. Vic, dying of a broken heart isn't real. A person simply cannot perish because of sadness. It is far more real than food attacking people, sir. And yet you accepted that more readily than the possibility that Vic dropped off. In the hour before he'd fall asleep on his yellow, mildewy, yet possibly comfortable couch, all he could think about was whether or not there was a place where Joe was waiting for him. And if so, would all be forgiven now. The thought of that being so guided him to sleep. Vic died in his sleep that night. A fellow survivor that would come once a week to check up on him found him on his couch. When she reported the sad news to the group, she was compelled to add one detail. But you know, when I found him, it was the strangest damn thing I'd ever seen. He looked happy. Most everyone agreed that happiness was not really Vic's style. They asked, how could she tell that? Well, it was the same look he'd get whenever he talked about reading that Hobbit book to his kid. I was bored when I was like, what if food started eating? And then it got all heart-rending. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.